You can access the entire episode now on our website, forbiddenknowledge.news, Rokfin, Rumble, and all podcast platforms. Do you think that these Hermetic teachings were demonized for a certain reason by the church? They are still heavily demonized. There's still plenty of groups and individuals that think that these teachings are evil. What do you think happened there?
Great question. The Hermetic writings, I think they have the same kind of tragedy that the Gnostic writings have, which is that they are very kind of similar in some ways to the language that we get in the Orthodox, quote-unquote, Christian scriptures. So you have the Logos, you have the Nous, the divine mind, you have the divine word. I would take Logos as another form of mind. I would translate that as well. But if you read much of the Hermetica, the syntax and the grammar and the words that are used are very similar, for example, to what we get in Johannine texts. So I think that there was a threat there, same with Gnostic literature, that this was stuff that sounded very similar to the terminology that Christians used, but it was giving kind of an alternate form of salvation, an alternate understanding of God, which did not gel with those deemed orthodoxy within the Christian tradition. So I think that the Hermetica was viewed as a threat because of that, because if you yourself have this divine spark, there's absolutely no need. There's no need at all for you to go to priest, to go to an organized religion per se, to get in touch with God. So the Hermetica there was very much, I think, a threat, just like the Gnostic scriptures was a threat to Orthodox Christianity. And I think that's why, knowledge of them was suppressed. There are some Christians who recognize the parallels between the Hermetica. So St. Augustine, for example, who himself was a Manichaean, so he came from a Gnostic sect. But I think for most Orthodox Christians, this was viewed as an alternative, a dangerous alternative to the type of spirituality that promoted them and promoted their own self-interest.
What are some of the insights that Cayce brought regarding the Hermetic teachings and principles? I know he had this consciousness connection to Atlantis and the events unfolding during that time period. So what did he connect with that?
Yeah, so he thought that Hermes was the incarnation of Jesus as Hermes, or the pre-life of Jesus as Hermes, was someone who was a preserver of knowledge. Going back to that idea of in the Hermetica, that knowledge is the path to salvation. And Hermes preserved the knowledge, the knowledge, the esoteric knowledge, the occult knowledge from Atlantis. And with that knowledge, he, along with Atum Ra, who Edgar Cayce takes as a historical figure. Remember, for most mythologists, Ra is a god, but for Edgar Cayce, Ra was a historical figure. Ra and Hermes are responsible for building the Great Pyramid of Gaza. And the Great Pyramid of Gaza was not a burial site, as is commonly argued for, not a burial site of the pharaohs, but a repository of knowledge and a place where initiations, occultic rites occurred. So for Cayce, that is the major contribution of Hermes as kind of the preserver of Atlantean knowledge. And he's kind of the linchpin, I know that's a bad term, the connector between this esoteric knowledge and the wisdom tradition that we get in Egypt, which permeates into Greece and in Greco-Roman spirituality. So, yes.
Now, I'd love to hear the parallels that you've come up with between Hermetic tradition and Mormonism. But first, you said you ascribe to a type of Mormonism that is different than the Church of Latter-day Saints. Could you tell us a little bit about what that difference is?
Yes. So my church, Church of Christ with the Elijah Message, we are kind of a group that was formed. Our origin is from one of their three people who were deemed witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And one of them, David Whitmer, he actually has a falling out with Joseph Smith and forms his own church. And there's another guy, Granville Hendrick. And so from the two of those, David Whitmer and Granville Hendrick, kind of our church emerges. We have similar scriptures to the Utah Latter-day Saints. I always call them my Utah brothers and sisters. So we believe in the Bible, King James Version. We believe in the Book of Mormon, but we also believe in a book called the Word of the Lord, which are revelations given to us by John the Baptist.
Before we get into the parallels between that and Hermeticism, could you tell us a little bit about the origins of the Book of Mormon and those teachings that aren't of the standard biblical text?
Yes. So the Book of Mormon is a revelation given to. It's not a revelation. I'll explain it in better detail. So in 1823, exactly about 200 years ago, the prophet Joseph Smith received gold plates from an angel named, in mainstream Latter-day Saint tradition, Moroni. We call him Nephi, but it's basically a record of what happened with the inhabitants on this continent, which we, in my tradition, believe to be the North American continent. Many Latter-day Saints, many Mormons will say that this happened in South America. We believe it happened in North America. But in any case, at some point during this history, Jesus Christ comes and preaches to the native inhabitants, Native Americans, on this continent. And much of what he preaches is very similar to what we have in the New Testament in our Bibles. And then he preaches some stuff that's just a little bit different. So there's an emphasis on unity. You kind of get this in the New Testament as well, but having no dissensions, no contentions, and also the idea of kind of a millennial reign coming to North America, that Christ will one day come again, rebuild a temple here in North America, and that there will be peace and harmony. But in order for that to happen, people have to behave. They have to act in accordance with God's law. So there's some stuff in the Book of Mormon. I would say stuff that's very similar. People always like bash the Book of Mormon and say it's like, this different book, but it's very similar. In fact, the subtitle for it is Another Testament of Jesus Christ. So it's very similar to a lot of the material that you get in the New Testament, but there are also other teachings of it as well, not just from Christ, but from other prophets. So there are a bunch of prophets in the Book of Mormon: Abinadi, Nephi himself, Alma, Samuel the Lamanite, etc. So there's a bunch of different teachings by different prophets in there as well.
That is interesting. Now let's get into the parallels with Hermeticism.
Yeah, the main parallel, and this is interesting because in both ancient tradition and in the Cayce readings and Edgar Cayce readings, Hermes is linked with the figure of Enoch, the biblical figure of Enoch. And there's a whole Enochian tradition. I know you've talked about this before. There's the Book of Enoch, which I recommend everyone read before they die. But in the Latter-day Saint scriptures, there is a book called the Pearl of Great Price. And a book in that is called the Book of Moses, which is actually the first 8 or so chapters of what we call the Joseph Smith translation, which was a revision of the Bible. And in that translation, there is an extended passage on Enoch and his ministry. So in the Old Testament, in the Masoretic text, in the Hebrew text, there's only one verse to Enoch. About Enoch, it says Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. And so God takes Enoch to heaven, and we never hear about him again. In the Pearl of Great Price, in the Book of Moses, there's 2 or 3 chapters devoted to Enoch, and in these chapters, Enoch builds a city called Zion. So he builds a city called Zion, and Zion is basically the repository of God's Spirit, and where proper knowledge, proper understanding of